Hey guys, thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Kumari Singh and today I want to tell you a story. There is absolutely nothing I love more than a story. I love to watch them, I love to read about them, I love to talk about them, I love to hear about them, and most of all, I love to tell them. And one of the most beautifulest things about a story to me is anyone can tell one. No matter where you go in life or what you do, someone will always have one to tell. And you don't need a degree, you don't need to be well spoken, you don't need to be some kind of genius, you don't need to be a literature enthusiast or anything like that. Everybody has the ability to tell a story. However, sometimes in life you can get really evil people who intentionally and maliciously cut somebody else's story short. And this kind of thing has happened time and time again, countless of times over the course of history. And not too long ago, on the 25th of May 2020, it happened again to a man named George Floyd. And so now George, just like the others, is unable to live out his story. And as human beings, as storytellers, as we've established anyone can tell a story, I feel it is our responsibility to make sure their stories are told, to make sure their stories are researched and shared and exposed. So the next time you hear somebody say to you, well actually, all lives matter, you can share these stories with them and then ask them, so why didn't his? Why didn't hers? Why didn't theirs? And I would like to share with you guys one of those stories that I have been researching for a couple of weeks now, that I found out about and I wanted to know more about, and I studied with a fine-tooth comb and I did a lot of homework on, and I want to tell you about it, if you want to listen. This is the story of George Stinney Jr. On the 23rd of March 1944, in Alcalá, South Carolina, there lived these two little girls by the name of Betty, who was 11 years old, and Mary, who was 7 years old. Now these two little girls were friends, and on the afternoon of the 23rd of March, they decided to go for a bike ride in the search of maypops, which were known to be some kind of fruit. Now, the mill town that the two little girls were living in at that time was under a Jim Crow segregation law, meaning the town was split into two, and so white people occupied one side and black people occupied the other. On the same day, on the 23rd of March, on the black side of town, there lived a little boy with his family by the name of George Stinney Jr. George was 14 years old, and he lived in a house with his mum, his dad, his two sisters and his brother. He also had an elder brother, but unfortunately he didn't live with them. He lived back in Pinewood, where they were originally from, with his grandmother. Now all the children in the Stinney household were given chores to do every single day, and one of George's allocated chores to do every single day was to take Lizzie the cow out onto the field to graze. And every day as he would carry out this chore, he would always have someone right behind him, and that person was his little sister Amy, who was around 8 years old at the time. And every day as he would take the cow out, he'd always look behind him, and sure enough, Amy would always be there, and he always used to say to her, "Why do you always follow me? You're just like my shadow." And she kind of liked that because she was, and so everywhere George went, Amy would go. So they both went out onto the field on this day, just like any other, to take Lizzie to go and eat. As they were on the field, they saw two little white girls approaching, pushing some bicycles. The two girls stopped and asked George and Amy if they knew anywhere where they could find some maypops. And George and Amy responded with no, they didn't. And so the girls walked on in search of their Maypops, and George and Amy never saw them again. On the evening of the 23rd of March 1944, unfortunately, Betty and Mary didn't make it home that night, and so a search party went out looking for them. And there was a knock on the Stinney household door, and George Sr., George Jr.'s father, opened the door and was told that 2 little girls had gone missing. And so George Sr. said that he would help look for them, and George Jr. said that he would go too. And so both family members went out and they searched pretty much all night for these 2 little girls. They searched until the early hours of the morning, where on the 24th of March 1944, both girls were found dead in a ditch. A couple of hours went by that morning of the 24th of March. The 2 parents went off to work. George's little sister Catherine went to the hair salon to get her hair done, and she was chaperoned by her elder brother. Amy, George's shadow, was outside in the front garden playing with some chickens their mother had recently brought, and their elder brother Johnny, who lived back in Pinewood with his grandmother, had come down for the day for a visit. And so George and Johnny were in their house and Amy was just outside. And as Amy was playing with the chickens, she saw these 2 funny looking black cars pull up to her drive. She had never seen these types of cars before. Heck, she had never seen these type of men before in these uniforms. And she got scared. So she hid in the chicken coop and she watched as these 2 men walked inside of her house. She doesn't know how long they were in there for, but she does know when they did come out, they had both her brothers in handcuffs, put them in the car and drove away. Amy, who was still in the chicken coop, she was beside herself. She didn't know what to do. She had just seen these 2 strangers come into her house and take her brothers away. And so Amy got out of the chicken coop and she ran as fast as she could to try and get some help. She ran to go try and find her parents. And on her way, she was seen by her brother and her sister in the hair salon. They obviously came out of the salon and asked what had happened, and she explained to them that her brothers had just been taken away. Meanwhile, back in the car, Johnny and George were being driven by the police and they didn't know where they were going, but they did know that halfway onto the highway, the car door opened and Johnny, the eldest brother, was thrown out onto the road. The car door shut and it drove on, with George inside. The car finally stopped and George noticed he was outside of a police station. They escorted him in and they started to ask him questions about a murder that had taken place. George was without any legal counsel or representation, and he was also without any adult supervision, being only 14 years old. And it wasn't too long before George was made to give a forced confession. Meanwhile, back at the Stinney household, everybody returned home to find Johnny and George missing. They were confused, they were shocked, they were scared, they were anxious, and on top of not knowing where their boys were, they caught word that a lynch mob was on their way to their home. George Stinney Sr., feeling scared about the lives of the rest of his family, decided to pack all of their bags and leave town. They decided to go back to Pinewood and stay with their grandmother, leaving George all alone. George's case inevitably went to trial in April. However, towards the build-up of the trial, not at any stage was the Stinney family contacted. Not one lawyer asked Amy to be a witness on the stand as she was present with her brother when citing the 2 girls. No one was called, no one was informed, and no one was asked anything. And on the day of his trial, George turned around in that big courtroom, and for the first time his shadow wasn't there. No one was there. There were not one familiar face, not one family member to be comforted by, And the trial, which was for murder, didn't even last a day. The trial was no more than 3 hours, and the only person to testify was the policeman who forced the confession out of George. Nor did George's lawyer at any point cross-examine the police officer. The trial was done, and the jury of all 12 white men went in to another room to deliberate. And it only took them 10 minutes. 10 minutes to find this little boy guilty. George was convicted in April, and he was the youngest person ever of the 20th century to be punished via the electric chair. And he was so tiny, so small, that on the day of his death, which was the 16th of June 1944, they made him sit on top of a Bible just so he could reach the headgear that would eventually bring him to his end. And George died that day. Amy could distinctly remember George's funeral. She remembers it so vividly that she can even recall the casket being slightly open, to which she looked inside and she saw her brother for the first time since that day he was taken away in that black car. And she could see that he was severely burned, even unrecognizable. And the family were distraught. They were so distraught. And they even had to bury their son and their brother in an unmarked grave. You see, they didn't want to put a headstone on his grave or anything like that because they were scared that people would come and desecrate it, maybe dig him up, do something with him. Not that he hadn't suffered enough. Days went by, months, and eventually years. But not one day went by without George's siblings thinking about him. And as the years went by, they've reached out to media outlets. They reached out to certain individuals to see if they could help them understand what happened to their brother, why it happened to their brother. They never stopped fighting for him, and although everybody who heard of George's story would only ask of his death, his siblings never failed to mention that George, although he was a quiet boy, he was very smart, and that he was very artistic, and he actually wanted to be an artist. And he loved aeroplanes, and he loved cars, and his mum had brought him this little pad, and he would take it everywhere he would go, and every time he saw a plane in the sky or a car drive by, he would try and draw it. He wanted to be an artist. It had been nearly 70 years since George Stinney Jr.'s death, and his siblings were still trying to find some help to try and clear their brother's name. And in 2013, at a law firm, a man by the name of Matt Burgess came across the Stinney file, and he read George's story, and he instantly knew that this little boy was wrongfully convicted. And so he got in contact with George Stinney's siblings and asked if he could take the case on, and that he would do it pro bono. And they agreed to this, and so the case was reopened in January 2014. Finally, this family had some hope. And so the two sisters travelled all the way back down to South Carolina for the retrial to give their version and their account of events of what took place on the 23rd and 24th of March 1944. And they severely expressed how one day their brother was there and the next day he wasn't. And not only that, the next time they saw him, he was in a casket, burned unrecognisable. And as this reopening of the trial progressed, the judge finally ruled that the conviction of George Stinney Jr, who was convicted of murder in April 1944, was incorrect, and that the case should be overturned. And the sisters, Catherine and Amy, were finally able to tell the world what they already knew, that their brother was innocent. But this overturnment of his case, of his conviction, didn't in any way rewind time, and it didn't in any way bring him back. On the 16th of June, which is approaching in a couple of days' time, it will mark the 76th anniversary of George Stinney Jr.'s death. And if he were to have been alive today, he would have been around 90 years of age. Had he survived that long, we'll never know, but what we do know is, had he been allowed to live in 1944, he would have had a better chance. Please, when the 16th of June arrives, take a moment to remember George and to appreciate your lives, and that George could be any one of your sons or your brothers. He was just a 14-year-old boy, and they killed him